A dusty street in Dodge City, Kansas, 1878. A cowboy draws his gun in a saloon dispute. Within seconds, he's facing the town marshal, a man who just 3 years ago was a buffalo hunter with no law enforcement experience whatsoever. The marshal's badge is simply a piece of tin pinned to his vest. He has no police academy training, no standardized procedures, no backup units to call. Just a gun, a reputation, and the authority that the town council gave him last Tuesday when they appointed him with a handshake and a promise of $75 a month. This was law enforcement on the American frontier, a world where yesterday's gambler became today's sheriff, where saloon owners moonlighted as deputy marshals, where the line between lawman and outlaw was so thin that some men crossed it multiple times in a single lifetime. Wyatt Earp, celebrated as a legendary lawman, was also accused of stage robbery. Wild Bill Hickok killed men as both a lawman and a gunfighter for hire. Many sheriffs had criminal records. Some were wanted in other jurisdictions even while wearing a badge. Welcome to frontier justice, where ordinary people with no qualifications became the law, where violence was the primary tool of order, and where the most dangerous outlaws and the most respected lawmen were sometimes impossible to tell apart. The frontier justice system that developed in the American West between roughly 1850 and 1900 emerged from a perfect storm of rapid expansion, absent government institutions, diverse and transient populations, and extreme violence. Understanding this system requires grasping both the unique conditions of the frontier and how radically different law enforcement was from anything that existed in the eastern United States or in settled nations. The westward expansion that followed the Mexican-American War, 1846–1848, and particularly the California Gold Rush, 1849, created boom towns overnight. Communities that didn't exist in January might have 5,000 residents by December, populations drawn from every corner of the nation and the world, sharing no common culture, recognizing no common authority, and united only by the pursuit of wealth through mining, cattle ranching, or commerce serving those industries. Dodge City, Kansas, was founded in 1872 and within 2 years had a population of over 1,200. Deadwood, South Dakota, sprang up in 1876 after gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Within months, it had thousands of residents living in tents and hastily constructed buildings. This explosive growth vastly outpaced governmental capacity. When settlers arrived in frontier regions, they often preceded any formal territorial government. Even after territories were organized, government presence was minimal. A territory might encompass hundreds of thousands of square miles but have only a handful of federal officials. Counties were enormous, sometimes larger than eastern states, with a single elected sheriff responsible for law enforcement across impossible distances. Towns might go years before having any formal incorporation or government structure. The population composition created unique challenges. Frontier towns were overwhelmingly male. Mining camps and cattle towns might be 90% or more men, with women arriving only later as communities stabilized. These were also transient populations. People came to get rich and planned to leave, creating little stake in long-term community stability. The populations were ethnically diverse but deeply divided. European Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese immigrants, African Americans, and displaced Native Americans occupied the same spaces, but in rigidly hierarchical relationships that frequently erupted into violence. Frontier economies were based on extractive industries, mining, cattle ranching, logging, that created boom-bust cycles, seasonal employment, and large populations of young men with money to spend during brief periods between months of grueling labor. Cattle towns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita experienced seasonal influxes of cowboys who had just been paid after months on the trail and wanted to drink, gamble, and visit prostitutes. Mining towns saw similar patterns when miners struck pay dirt or received wages. This created predictable cycles of disorder, violence, and crime. The legal framework was rudimentary and confusing. Federal law applied to federal crimes, mail robbery, crimes on federal land, counterfeiting. But federal law enforcement was nearly absent. U.S. Marshals existed but were few in number and covered vast territories. Territorial governments passed laws, but enforcement mechanisms were minimal. County governments existed, but county sheriffs were elected officials with no training, serving part-time while maintaining other occupations. Town governments, when they existed, appointed marshals or constables, but these positions were also minimally professionalized. This created the core characteristic of frontier law enforcement. It was performed by ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, gamblers, former soldiers, buffalo hunters, who were appointed or elected to law enforcement positions with no training, no established procedures, no oversight, and minimal pay. A man might be tending bar one day and pinning on a deputy's badge the next because the town marshal needed help during the cattle season. He would receive no instruction beyond, keep the peace and don't get killed. The tools of law enforcement were primitive. There were no radios, no telephones, until the 1880s-90s, and then only in larger towns. No fingerprinting, no photographs of wanted criminals, until late in the period, no databases. A lawman's tools were personal weapons, typically a revolver and sometimes a shotgun, a jail, often just a single room or even a dugout, and his personal reputation. Law enforcement depended on the lawman's ability to physically dominate others through violence or the credible threat of violence. The violence levels were extraordinary by modern standards. Frontier towns had homicide rates that would be considered catastrophic today. A study by historian Roger McGrath found that Bodie, California, a mining town, had a homicide rate of 116 per 100,000 people in 1880, roughly 20 times the modern U.S. rate. Dodge City, during its wildest years, saw dozens of killings annually in a town of just a few thousand. Violence was so common that newspapers reporting killings often devoted just a few sentences to incidents, unless they involved particularly prominent people or unusual circumstances. Within this environment, law enforcement became a high-risk occupation performed by men who were often indistinguishable from the criminals they pursued. The badge provided legal authority to kill, arrest, and use force, but it didn't transform buffalo hunters into professional police officers. It simply empowered ordinary men, sometimes capable and honorable, sometimes corrupt and violent, often somewhere in between, to impose order through whatever means they could manage. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok's brief tenure as Marshal of Abilene, Kansas in 1871 perfectly illustrates both the mythology and reality of frontier law enforcement, showing how an ordinary man with a violent reputation became a lawman in a town desperate for order. Hickok arrived in Abilene with a reputation already established through dime novels and newspaper accounts that exaggerated his exploits as a Union scout during the Civil War and as a gunfighter who had killed numerous men. Whether these stories were accurate was less important than the fact that people believed them. When Abilene's town council needed a marshal to control the cattle season crowds, they hired Hickok in April 1871, specifically because his reputation might intimidate potential troublemakers without requiring actual violence. Abilene was at the height of its cattle boom. It served as a terminus for cattle drives from Texas, where cowboys would deliver herds to be shipped east by railroad. During the season, roughly March through September, the town's population swelled from about 800 permanent residents to several thousand, as Texas cowboys arrived with months of wages to spend. The Texas Street District was lined with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. Violence was routine fights, shootings, stabbings occurred nightly. Hickok's law enforcement methods were straightforward and depended entirely on his personal capabilities rather than any systematic procedures. He patrolled the streets, typically spending time in the saloons where trouble was most likely. When disputes arose, he would intervene personally, using his reputation and imposing presence to diffuse situations. When that didn't work, he used violence. Hickok had no training in de-escalation, no procedures for arrest, no backup officers except a few occasional deputies. He operated entirely on his own judgment about when force was necessary. Town records document that he arrested individuals for carrying firearms. Abilene had an ordinance against carrying guns in town, and for disturbing the peace, usually by physically subduing them and throwing them in jail overnight to sober up. The violence of Hickok's tenure culminated in two incidents that reveal frontier law enforcement's brutal reality. In October 1871, Hickok shot and killed a Texas gambler named Phil Coe after Coe fired a pistol on the street. Whether at Hickok or at a stray dog is disputed in historical accounts. In the confusion following Coe's shooting, Hickok also accidentally shot and killed his own deputy, Mike Williams, who came running to assist and whom Hickok mistook for another threat in the darkness. This incident, a marshal killing his own deputy while also killing a civilian in disputed circumstances, would today result in investigations, lawsuits, and probably criminal charges. In 1871 Abilene, there was no formal investigation. The town council simply decided not to renew Hickok's contract when the cattle season ended. He had kept violence manageable during the boom season, which was his job, but the accidental killing of a deputy and the ongoing cost of his salary led the town to dispense with his services. No charges were filed. Hickok simply left town. The Hickok case reveals several crucial aspects of frontier law enforcement. Hickok's effectiveness depended on his reputation deterring conflict, rather than on any systematic law enforcement. His celebrity status was more valuable than his actual skills. A lawman could kill two men, including his own deputy, and face no formal consequences beyond losing his job. There was no investigative process, no review board, no criminal justice system oversight. Law enforcement was a job you took for a season, not a profession or calling. Hickok was hired to manage a specific problem, cattle season disorder, and dismissed when that season ended, just as you might hire seasonal workers for a harvest. Hickok's tools were his personal weapons and willingness to use lethal force. There was no concept of minimal necessary force or graduated response. The lawman's judgment about when to shoot was essentially unreviewable. Nothing prepared Hickok for law enforcement except his experience with violence. He received no training in Kansas law, arrest procedures, or use of force standards. These things simply didn't exist. The Earp brothers' time in Tombstone, Arizona Territory represents frontier law enforcement at its most morally ambiguous, where the line between lawman and criminal disappeared entirely, and where badges were tools for personal and economic advantage as much as public service. The Earps Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and sometimes James and Warren arrived in Tombstone in 1879 drawn by the silver boom. None came as lawmen, they came as entrepreneurs seeking fortune. Wyatt initially worked as a shotgun guard for Wells Fargo, but the family's real interests were in gambling, saloon ownership, and the potential profits from mining claims. Virgil was appointed as Tombstone's town marshal, the city's chief law enforcement officer, in 1880, and he occasionally deputized his brothers. This created immediate conflicts of interest that would be completely unacceptable today but were routine on the frontier. Virgil was the chief law officer of a town where his brothers owned gambling concessions and stakes in saloons, businesses that depended on attracting exactly the sort of rough clientele that law enforcement was supposed to control. When bar fights or gambling disputes occurred in establishments where the Earps had financial interests, the town marshal was called to resolve them, creating obvious conflicts between the Earps' roles as lawmen and businessmen. The situation was even more complex. Wyatt Earp was simultaneously working as a deputy sheriff under the county sheriff, a different jurisdiction from town marshal, operating gambling concessions, and reportedly involved in buying and selling stolen cattle and horses, activities that were technically criminal. Contemporary documents, including letters from Wyatt to friends, suggest he participated in or benefited from stagecoach robberies while holding law enforcement positions. The Earp faction's primary rivals in Tombstone were the Cowboys, a loosely organized group of ranchers and rustlers including the Clanton and McLaury families. The conflict between the Earps and Cowboys had multiple dimensions: political Republicans versus Democrats, economic competing for criminal profits, and personal, various feuds and insults. Law enforcement authority became a weapon in this conflict. The October 26, 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral, actually on Fremont Street near the Corral, demonstrates how law enforcement authority could be weaponized for personal vendettas. Virgil Earp, as town marshal, decided to enforce Tombstone's ordinance against carrying firearms in town by confronting the Clantons and McLaurys who were armed. He deputized his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, plus friend Doc Holliday. The resulting confrontation killed 3 cowboys and wounded Virgil and Morgan Earp. The question that haunted the aftermath: was this legitimate law enforcement or a planned murder using badges as cover? The cowboys were indeed violating the firearms ordinance, giving Virgil legal authority to disarm them. But did the situation require a confrontation by 4 heavily armed men that was almost certain to result in gunfire? Or did Virgil use his marshal's authority as justification to attack rivals? The legal proceedings that followed the shootout were revealing. The Cowboys filed murder charges against the Earps and Holliday. A month-long preliminary hearing before Judge Wells Spicer examined whether the Earps had acted legally. Spicer ultimately ruled they had. Virgil had been performing his duty as marshal, and the others had been legally deputized. But this verdict didn't settle the matter for the participants. The Cowboys, believing the legal system had failed them, turned to extra-legal violence. In December 1881, Virgil Earp was ambushed and crippled by shotgun fire. In March 1882, Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards. Wyatt, rather than seeking legal justice, formed a federal posse. He held a deputy U.S. Marshal commission and embarked on the vendetta ride, hunting down and killing several men he believed responsible for his brother's attacks. He was never prosecuted for these killings because he claimed they were done under color of law enforcement authority. The Earp saga demonstrates how frontier law enforcement blurred every line that modern policing tries to maintain. Badges were sources of income through fees for arrests and serving papers, and through the protection they afforded for side businesses. The Earps used law enforcement positions to advance personal economic interests. Lawmen could own saloons, gambling operations, and other businesses that they were theoretically policing, creating massive conflicts of interest. Law enforcement authority could be invoked to give legal cover to actions that were really about personal feuds and economic rivalry. Even after a gunfight that killed 3 people raised questions about whether lawmen had committed murder, the review process was perfunctory and easily influenced by political connections. Many frontier lawmen operated in gray areas or crossed into clear criminality while wearing badges. This was so common as to be unremarkable. Bass Reeves's remarkable career as a deputy U.S. Marshal in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, demonstrates that frontier law enforcement could be performed with integrity and professionalism. But his exceptionalism highlights how rare such conduct was and how much it depended on individual character rather than institutional structures. Reeves was born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838, escaped during the Civil War, and lived with Creek and Seminole tribes in Indian Territory, learning indigenous languages and becoming expert at wilderness survival. When Judge Isaac Parker established his federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas in 1875, He needed deputy marshals to serve warrants and bring in fugitives from the 75,000 square miles of Indian Territory, an area with minimal law enforcement and a reputation as a refuge for outlaws fleeing state jurisdictions. Parker hired Reeves, making him one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi. For 32 years, Reeves served warrants in some of the most dangerous territory in the nation. He arrested over 3,000 people, killed 14 in self-defense, and was never wounded, an extraordinary record in a profession where violent death was common. What made Reeves exceptional wasn't supernatural skill, but meticulous professionalism in a field where professionalism barely existed. He couldn't read or write. He remained illiterate throughout his life, so he memorized the details of every warrant he carried. He prepared carefully for each assignment, gathering intelligence about his targets and planning his approach. He used disguises and deception rather than relying solely on violence, posing as a drifter, a preacher, or an outlaw to get close to fugitives before revealing his identity. Most remarkably, Reeves maintained absolute commitment to law over personal interest. In 1902, his own son, Benny Reeves, murdered his wife. Bass took the warrant for his son's arrest personally, tracked Benny down, and brought him in for trial. Benny was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. This devotion to duty over family loyalty was extraordinary in an era when nepotism and corruption were endemic. Reeves's career highlights what frontier law enforcement could be with the right individual, but also highlights how much it depended on that individual. There were no institutional structures ensuring professionalism. No training program taught Reeves to memorize warrants or use disguises. No oversight body ensured he pursued his own son impartially. These were Reeves's personal choices, reflecting his character. The contrast with the Earps is instructive. Both Reeves and the Earps were frontier lawmen operating in similar timeframes and similarly lawless regions. But Reeves viewed his badge as a sacred trust, requiring absolute integrity, while the Earps viewed their badges as tools for personal advantage. The difference wasn't institutional. It was personal character operating in an environment with minimal institutional constraints. Reeves's story also reveals the racial complexity of frontier law enforcement. As a black man in a virulently racist era, Reeves faced discrimination and danger not just from criminals but from white society. Yet his skill and reputation earned him grudging respect from many who would normally refuse to recognize black authority. He arrested white, black, and Native American fugitives, demonstrating a commitment to law that transcended racial divisions, something virtually unique in his time. When Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, ending the federal jurisdiction that gave Reeves his authority, he was 69 years old. He spent his final working years as a beat cop in Muskogee, Oklahoma, bringing professionalism to city policing just as he had to frontier marshaling. He died in 1910, having demonstrated what frontier law enforcement could be, while also demonstrating by his exceptionalism how rarely it achieved that standard. The Lincoln County War demonstrates how completely frontier law enforcement could break down, with competing factions both claiming legal authority and both operating as criminals, until the distinction between lawman and outlaw became meaningless. Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory in the late 1870s, was dominated by economic competition between rival merchant factions. On one side was the House, a business monopoly controlled by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan that dominated government contracts, land, and credit. On the other was a competing faction led by Alexander McSween and John Tunstall, British-born entrepreneurs trying to break the monopoly. Both factions used law enforcement as weapons. The House faction controlled the county sheriff, William Brady, who used his authority to harass McSween-Tunstall interests, serving questionable warrants, seizing property, and generally making life difficult for the competition. When the McSween-Tunstall faction couldn't get relief from local law enforcement or courts, both controlled by rivals, They formed their own law enforcement group. The McSween-Tunstall faction obtained commissions as regulators, essentially private police authorized by a justice of the peace sympathetic to their cause. These regulators, which included a young William Bonney, later famous as Billy the Kid, claimed legal authority to serve warrants and make arrests, but they were really a private army fighting an economic war under color of law. The situation descended into chaos in February 1878 when Sheriff Brady's posse killed John Tunstall. The regulators, claiming to be enforcing warrants against Tunstall's killers, tracked down and executed several men involved. Not arrests and trials, but extrajudicial killings that they claimed were legal law enforcement. When Brady tried to arrest regulators, they ambushed and killed him and a deputy, killing the county sheriff while claiming to be lawmen themselves. By April 1878, Lincoln County had competing groups both claiming legal authority. The new sheriff, appointed to replace Brady, represented the House faction. The regulators claimed authority from a justice of the peace. Both groups arrested, imprisoned, and killed people while claiming to enforce law. Both were essentially armed gangs serving private interests, but both wore badges and cited legal authority. The conflict culminated in July 1878 with a 5-day siege in Lincoln, where the regulators holed up in the McSween house and exchanged gunfire with the sheriff's posse and U.S. Army troops. The Army's involvement, federal soldiers supporting one faction in what was essentially a private war, demonstrated how thoroughly governmental authority had been captured by private interests. The siege ended with McSween's death and the regulators' dispersal. The Lincoln County War shows frontier law enforcement's ultimate failure state, when badges became mere props in private conflicts, when legal authority meant nothing more than the ability to kill rivals with impunity, when there was no higher authority capable of sorting legitimate from illegitimate claims to police power. It showed that, without institutional structures constraining police power, law enforcement could become indistinguishable from organized crime. The aftermath is telling. Participants on both sides went unpunished. The House faction eventually lost political power, but its members faced no criminal consequences for their use of law enforcement as a private army. The regulators dispersed. Some, like Billy the Kid, continued as outlaws, while others simply melted into other communities. The violence had been entirely outside any legitimate legal process, but the frontier's weak institutions couldn't or wouldn't hold anyone accountable. The frontier justice system, where ordinary people became lawmen, had profound and lasting impacts on American culture, law enforcement development, and national mythology that continue to influence how Americans think about police, violence, and authority. Frontier law enforcement's reliance on personal firearms as the primary tool of policing helped establish firearms as symbols of authority and masculine competence. The lawman gunfighter became an iconic American figure, and the association between guns and legitimate authority became deeply embedded in American culture. This differs markedly from other nations, where police authority was established through institutional structures rather than personal weapons. The frontier experience, where effective law enforcement required personal weaponry, contributed to American gun culture's persistence. The idea that individuals might need to be their own police, that firearms are necessary for self-protection, because official authorities might not be available or reliable. The frontier's failure to professionalize law enforcement had lasting effects. Unlike other nations that developed professional police forces in the mid-19th century with standardized training, career structures, and accountability mechanisms, American law enforcement remained fragmented and minimally professionalized well into the 20th century. Many American police departments didn't require high school diplomas until the 1960s, didn't provide substantial training until the 1970s, and still struggle with accountability issues that frontier law enforcement exemplified. The frontier pattern of hiring ordinary people with minimal qualifications and giving them broad authority with limited oversight established precedents that proved difficult to overcome. The frontier model, where lawmen supplemented meager salaries through fees, business interests, and sometimes criminal activities, established patterns of police corruption that persisted for generations. Urban police forces in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often operated on similar principles, officers augmenting pay through graft, protecting illegal businesses, and using their authority for personal profit. The idea that a badge was both public service and private opportunity, so normalized on the frontier, proved difficult to eradicate in later policing. Frontier justices' blurred lines between official lawmen and vigilantes helped legitimize extra-legal violence in American culture. When recognized lawmen like Wyatt Earp conducted vendetta killings, or when entire towns supported vigilance committees that acted outside legal processes, it established precedents that citizens could rightfully bypass law when they deemed it inadequate. This vigilante tradition, validated by frontier experience, contributed to later phenomena like lynch mobs and contemporary militia movements that claim legitimacy for extra-legal violence. While frontier law enforcement is often portrayed as colorblind meritocracy, where ability mattered more than background, the reality was that law enforcement primarily served white interests and enforced racial hierarchies. Bass Reeves was exceptional partly because he was exceptional, but also because law enforcement positions were generally reserved for whites. When Black, Mexican, Chinese, or Native American people encountered frontier lawmen, they typically experienced law enforcement as oppression rather than protection. This racialized policing, where different groups received different treatment based on race, became embedded in American law enforcement culture. Frontier lawmen became central figures in American mythology, the lone figure bringing order to chaos through personal courage and violence. This mythology, heavily promoted through dime novels, Wild West shows, and later through film and television, created lasting cultural narratives about how justice should work, through strong individuals willing to use violence, rather than through institutions and due process. This mythology has made police reform difficult because it valorizes exactly the kind of unaccountable personal authority that modern reforms try to constrain. The frontier pattern of locally elected sheriffs and town-appointed marshals with no higher authority established American law enforcement's extreme fragmentation. Thousands of independent agencies with no national standards, minimal coordination, and local accountability only. This differs from most developed nations which have national or regional police forces with uniform standards. This fragmentation has advantages: local responsiveness, federalism, but also severe disadvantages: inability to track criminals across jurisdictions, inconsistent standards, difficulty implementing reforms. Frontier lawmen used violence not as a last resort but as a primary tool. There was no doctrine of minimal force, no requirement to exhaust nonviolent options before shooting. This established cultural patterns where police violence was seen as normal and necessary, rather than as a serious use of force requiring justification. Modern debates about police violence echo these frontier patterns, where officers' decisions to use lethal force are often presumed justified unless proven otherwise, rather than requiring officers to justify why violence was necessary. Frontier justices focus on individual lawmen's character rather than institutional structures, established the bad apple theory of police misconduct, the idea that problems arise from individual officers' failings rather than from systemic issues. When a frontier lawman went bad, the solution was replacing him, not reforming the system. This individualized understanding of police problems has made systemic reforms difficult because it locates responsibility in individual officers rather than in the structures, training, and accountability mechanisms that shape police behavior. The frontier justice system, where ordinary people pinned on badges and became lawmen, seems impossibly distant from modern professional policing with its academies, standards, and regulations. Yet examining frontier law enforcement reveals surprising continuities and illuminates contemporary debates about police reform, accountability, and the nature of police authority. Modern qualified immunity doctrine, which protects police officers from civil liability for actions taken in their official capacity, unless they violate clearly established constitutional rights, essentially recreates frontier law enforcement's minimal accountability. Frontier lawmen faced virtually no consequences for violence, bad judgment, or abuse of authority unless they lost political support. Modern qualified immunity similarly shields officers from consequences, requiring victims to prove violations of rights that courts had previously recognized in nearly identical circumstances, a standard so high that it effectively grants impunity similar to what frontier lawmen enjoyed. Modern warrior cop training that teaches officers to view policing as combat and to prioritize officer safety above all else directly descends from frontier lawman mythology. Training materials frequently invoke Wild West imagery, portraying officers as lone warriors facing constant danger who must be willing to use violence decisively. This training ignores that frontier violence levels were extraordinary and that frontier law enforcement's shoot-first approach was a failure that professional policing was supposed to improve upon. Yet the mythology persists, shaping modern police culture. The frontier model of elected sheriffs continues in most American counties, making sheriffs unique among law enforcement officials in their direct democratic accountability. While this can ensure responsiveness to local values, it also creates problems when sheriffs claim their elected status gives them authority to refuse to enforce laws they disagree with, as some sheriffs have done regarding gun control laws, immigration enforcement, or COVID-19 regulations. These sheriffs invoke frontier-era principles about local autonomy and elected lawmen's independence from higher authorities, even when this conflicts with rule of law principles. The frontier practice of lawmen earning fees for services rendered continues in modern policing through civil asset forfeiture, traffic ticket quotas, and court fines that fund police operations. When police departments depend on revenue from enforcement activities, it creates the same perverse incentives that frontier lawmen faced, encouragement to focus on revenue-generating activities rather than public safety. Ferguson, Missouri's Justice Department investigation revealed policing practices almost identical to frontier fee-based systems, where arrests and citations were driven by revenue needs rather than legitimate law enforcement purposes. American law enforcement remains extraordinarily fragmented, over 18,000 separate police agencies with no national training standards, no uniform use of force policies, no centralized accountability. This fragmentation directly continues frontier patterns where each town and county created its own law enforcement without reference to broader standards. Most developed nations have national police forces or strong national standards. America's frontier legacy of extreme localism persists, making national reforms nearly impossible. Modern discourse sometimes suggests that police reform requires bringing in outsiders who aren't corrupted by existing police culture, echoing the frontier practice of hiring sheriffs with no law enforcement background. But the frontier experience suggests this doesn't work. Giving badges to outsiders without systematic training, clear standards, and accountability mechanisms produce the problems we're still addressing. Personal character matters, but Bass Reeves's exceptionalism demonstrates that reform can't depend on finding exceptional individuals. It requires building institutions that make good policing the default rather than the exception. Some police reform advocates invoke frontier or small-town law enforcement as models of community policing where officers knew residents personally and were accountable to neighbors. But this romanticizes frontier reality. Frontier lawmen weren't community servants. They were often transients hired to control other transients. Their accountability came from fear of being shot, not from institutional oversight. True community policing requires institutional structures that frontier justice lacked. Perhaps the deepest continuity is cultural acceptance of police violence as normal and necessary. Frontier law enforcement succeeded through violence and the threat of violence. Modern policing has inherited this assumption that police authority ultimately rests on the ability and willingness to use force, that some situations can only be resolved through violence. Police reform efforts challenge this assumption, suggesting that violence should be truly a last resort, and that much of what police do shouldn't involve force at all. But frontier law enforcement's violent legacy makes this cultural shift difficult. Modern media's fascination with individual police heroes, from J. Edgar Hoover to Dirty Harry to real-life officers made famous through media, continues frontier traditions of celebrity lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok. This focus on individual heroes rather than institutional functions obscures that modern policing should be about systems, not exceptional individuals. The frontier succeeded when it got lucky with people like Bass Reeves. It failed when it got people like the Earps. Modern policing needs to succeed regardless of which individuals wear badges, but celebrity cop culture undermines institutional focus. The frontier justice system, where ordinary people became lawmen, represents one of American history's most fascinating social experiments, and one of its most instructive failures. In the absence of established institutions, frontier communities improvised law enforcement by giving badges to buffalo hunters, gamblers, and gunfighters, hoping that personal reputation and willingness to use violence would be sufficient to maintain order. Sometimes it worked, after a fashion. Bass Reeves demonstrated that an exceptional individual with personal integrity could enforce law fairly even without institutional support. Some frontier towns achieved reasonable order through local lawmen who managed to keep violence within tolerable bounds. The system wasn't complete chaos. It was improvised, violent, and deeply flawed governance that somehow allowed frontier communities to function. But mostly it failed. The violence levels were appalling. Corruption was endemic. The line between lawmen and criminals disappeared entirely. Justice was arbitrary, depending on which faction controlled local offices. Marginalized populations, racial minorities, women, the poor, received no protection and often faced law enforcement as a tool of oppression. The casualties included not just criminals and outlaws, but innocent people caught in crossfire, victims of lawmen's abuses, and communities traumatized by chronic violence. The frontier experience demonstrated conclusively that law enforcement cannot be left to ordinary people given badges with no training, standards, or accountability. The transition to professional policing that occurred gradually in the late 19th and early 20th centuries represented recognition that maintaining order in modern society requires specialized skills, institutional structures, and accountability mechanisms that frontier improvisation couldn't provide. Yet we didn't learn all the lessons we should have. American law enforcement retained too much of its frontier character: extreme fragmentation, minimal training requirements, weak accountability, cultural valorization of violence, and the assumption that badges authorize broad discretion with limited oversight. We professionalized police in some ways while keeping structural features that reflect frontier conditions no longer relevant to modern society. The challenge today is completing the unfinished work of moving beyond frontier justice. This means treating policing as a profession requiring substantial training and ongoing education. It means creating robust accountability mechanisms so that officers who abuse authority face consequences, not the impunity frontier lawmen enjoyed. It means recognizing that good policing can't depend on finding exceptional individuals like Bass Reeves, but requires institutions that make good policing standard practice. And it means acknowledging that much of what police do shouldn't require force at all. That frontier law enforcement's violent improvisation isn't a model to emulate but a failure to move beyond. The frontier lawmen in their dusty streets confronting armed cowboys are long gone. But the questions they embodied remain. What authority do we grant to police? How do we ensure they use it justly? What accountability do we demand? How do we balance order with rights, safety with freedom? The frontier answered these questions badly through violence and improvisation. We can do better, but only if we honestly confront that legacy rather than romanticizing it. What do you think? Does modern policing still carry too much frontier DNA? Can we learn from figures like Bass Reeves without romanticizing frontier violence? How do we build policing that serves everyone, not just the powerful? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of frontier justice enlightening, subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the historical roots of modern American institutions, understanding where we came from to imagine where we should go. Hit that notification bell for our next deep dive into the systems that shaped America. And if you believe understanding history is essential to reforming the present, please like and share this video. The frontier's ordinary people who became lawmen created legacies we're still grappling with. Understanding their world helps us build a better one. Thanks for watching, and remember, every modern police reform debate echoes arguments that began when frontier towns first pinned badges on buffalo hunters and hoped for the best.